Hello and welcome to the video. So in this one, I want to bring your attention to two Horus Heresy maps that are being used to support the Siege of Terra series. It's really the culmination of the just insanely lengthy Horus Heresy, book series here. And the first map on the left is the Sol system, and the map on the right is the map of the Siege of the Imperial Palace on Terra. And I recently watched Dan Abnett's interview about the Siege of Terra on Warhammer TV, and during the course of that interview, Dan really emphasized that there was an unforeseen need to spatially map out these spaces so that the authors could coordinate locations and basically ensure that they possessed a common spatial awareness. The use and examples of maps in Warhammer is something that I have wanted to discuss for some time, and I just couldn't pass on these two excellent examples. So, because they're really quite unique, they're something different than we've seen before. Now, I'll come back to these maps and talk about each in detail. But first, I want to provide some examples of historical maps and discuss some context. Alright, let's zoom in here a little bit. Whoop, too far. Alright. So, the beautiful high definition maps here are basically from the collection at the Osher Map Library at the University of Southern Maine. I love maps and cartography. And it's really become intertwined in my career. In my professional life, I'm an academic librarian, and every position that I've had over the past 8 years has dealt with maps and cartography in some capacity. And all this started when I first worked at a map library, where I was really exposed to thousands of rare and expensive maps printed over the past 5 centuries. So, in the course of the video, I'm not arguing that my senses of aesthetics is more pronounced or refined when it comes to maps, but simply that I have a great deal of exposure and appreciation for that type of medium. So, not too long ago, I spent a lot of time studying and translating a series of 16th century maps created and published by the Flemish cartographer Abraham Ortelius. Ortelius is well known in cartographic circles, mostly because, among other accomplishments, he published the first conventional atlas called the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, basically translated as the theater of the world, an atlas of the known world at the time. And this was first published in 1570. But Ortelius is also known as the father of historical cartography, which is basically the creation of maps that present the world as it once was in a past historical period. Some of you might know that I'm fairly obsessed with ancient history, and Ortelius had the same obsession. His goal for creating maps was always for the study of history, as demonstrated in the preface of the Theatrum, where he quite proudly proclaims that geography is the eye of history. The Theatrum was kind of an amazing commercial success, and a few years later, he added an additional text onto it called the Paragon. So this is spelled P-A-R-E-R-G-O-N. It's a fairly obscure Greek word that you can find in some Latin texts, and it basically means an embellishment or an accessory. Now this is complete false modesty on Ortelius' part, because over the next couple decades the Paragon grew quite rapidly, and Ortelius really poured himself into these maps, devoting far more attention and detail into that book than the original Theatrum. So all this is a very roundabout way of saying that the map before you is from Ortelius' Paragon, one of only 3 maps in the first edition of that text, and a map that Ortelius first completed in 1571, just 1 year after the Theatrum was published. It's just an absolutely beautiful map. I absolutely love working on this one, and kind of studying it and translating it. It's really quite beautiful. And so this map is called the Romani Imperii Imago. And that basically means an image of the Roman Empire or representation of the Roman Empire. And to my knowledge, it is the first attempt to visually recreate the Roman Empire as it once existed. It's not perfect, and Ortelius made a few errors, but it's an extraordinary first attempt. So let's quickly go over some of the fine detail here. So, for whatever reason, this thing is very temperamental. Up in the upper left here, you have these busts. And these are basically a bust. Up in the top left here is Mercury. The one on the other side is Romulus. And, they have these little quotes associated with them. And there's really kind of quotes all over this map. There's a lot of veneration here for ancient history and ancient texts. The quote up in the upper left here says, Rome, in your name, the world is destined to be ruled. And I believe, let's see here. And let me just quickly take a look here. Yeah, that's right. And then there's another quote in this map that says, the divine mind set up the state of the Roman people with an excellent and temperate region, so they might acquire the whole world of empire. Yeah, that's this quote here from Vitruvius. And these excerpts are kind of powerful statements designed to assert, praise, and justify Roman supremacy. So there are numerous notes on this map. Generally speaking, places like here, where you can see in the middle of Dacia and others. This actually doesn't have quite as many as some of the others I've looked at, but it's still a pretty magnificent type of map. Just beautiful colors, very vibrant. And there are also kind of other little pieces here. This portion down here is basically a summary of every single Roman conquest and military campaign. It's super condensed, but it's kind of fun to read through. You also have over here kind of a depiction of the Roman wolf and the twins Remus and Romulus below. A very early depiction of that. Below that here is a genealogical tree of the early Roman kings before the Republic. And, it's just an enormously interesting type of historical map that just venerates the past. Let's quickly look at a second map. So this is the Argonautica, which is basically a map of the voyage of Jason and the Argonauts. So I'm using this map specifically as a counterexample because the first map is clearly about history, right? It portrays a historical period that we all know once existed. This map about Jason and the Argonauts really blurs the line between history and myth. And, it's important to recognize that line can really happen quite easily. And that, for Ortelius's part, he treats this subject as being purely historical. There's not really much of a sense, even when you read each of these maps comes with a pretty lengthy piece of Latin that discusses the topic. There's not really a sense there that he was expressly clear that this was not history. There's not really much of a clear distinction. So this is, again, an interesting map, and, describes some of the famous figures and scenes. Ortelius is one of the first people to really try to map out, again, kind of tales and features that are highly unusual. So when you zoom in on some of these there are multiple maps like this by Ortelius that do this. But this is basically, he says, this is the island here off the boot of Italy where the nymph Calypso resided. You see the whirlpool here of a Charybdis, and the monster here. And then these are the islands with the sirens. It's just kind of, the attempt to try to locate where exactly these types of things are going on in, the epic myths is kind of an interesting intellectual pursuit. You can see one thing about these types of maps is that these were hand-drawn, or rather printed maps that were hand-colored. So you can see like where the colors kind of go over the lines. I think it's more kind of, there's a kind of a little blotch mistake there. You can see it doesn't quite follow a lot of the pieces. Pretty significant. These are hand-colored, and mostly by women and children. So it's kind of this interesting little body of work. Ortelius himself used to color maps. That's how his career started. But in the middle here, you see the golden fleece hanging in a tree, defended by bulls, and the dragon, just as described in the story. One of the reasons I wanted to use this map as kind of a counterexample is because it does feature these little insets. And Ortelius has a little descriptive text for each of them that explains why he's using them. Basically, he says there's more detail than he can provide here. So this is, a version of the Black Sea and going through the Sea of Marmara and the Hellespont. Just kind of, these little insets are important, and they're displayed on one of these new maps for the Horus Heresy. So one thing I want to impress upon people is that these maps are not really designed to provide a sense of space. And the basic connections, all they do is provide the basic connections between the geographic areas. They're not necessarily designed for practical travel between point A and point B. The Theatrum is the most expensive book ever produced in human history. So it's not the type of book that you're going to be taking if you want to travel from Paris to Italy. That's not the book you're going to grab. And frankly, most of these maps, all maps are some form of abstraction or are distorted in some fashion. You can't project a three-dimensional object onto a two-dimensional field without some sort of weird effect. And that's largely unavoidable. And it's also perfectly fine. So the purpose I'm showing you these types of historical maps is to provide really a frame of reference. And I want viewers to make a mental note of the attention, the devotion, kind of the obsession given to the subject. Right? Ortelius clearly loved this thing to actually design it himself and have it colored this way and everything else. And everything is just highly over-embellished. The art, the colors, the style, it's kind of like exaggerated. And the clear reverence that Ortelius really held for ancient authors and ancient history. You get a good sense of this in the map. These are some of the notes that I'm talking about before that accompany, these parts of the map. But Ortelius, when you actually read the accompanied text, this guy knows his stuff extremely well. This is someone that converted his home into a museum of antiquity. Those two busts on this map are based upon coins in his own personal collection. He's really infusing this with everything that he has. This is the passion that kind of drives his life. So kind of keep those themes in mind when we go back to the maps that represent the Horus Heresy in the 31st millennium, because they're kind of a good imitation of a historical map. And, those types of maps should also have themes of veneration, obsession, and kind of over-attention. So let's go back to first the Sol System map here. I wish I had a higher definition version of this, but one really isn't available. I'm going to go into the slideshow, just so there's a kind of a black background to it. Alright. So just so everyone's on the same page, if you're not super familiar with the Horus Heresy or something like that, and why it's different than, say, the 41st millennium. The 31st millennium is a time of science, progress, optimism, and really genuinely a time when heroes and gods lived among humanity. There's strong parallels there to like our classical antiquity. And in contrast, the 41st millennium is a time of dogma, fear of technology, and really kind of despair, where everyone is living on the knife's edge, and they're all looking back at the past for inspiration and comfort. Kind of as Aristotle says, nothing can come from the void. So what I mean by that phrase is that everything, our own history acts both as the artistic inspiration for these types of maps, for these types of worlds, and the basis for the story. So essentially the 41st millennium is stuck in our Middle Ages with some sort of trappings of the Renaissance, but there's not really a prospect of the Enlightenment. And so when I think of these types of maps like this, I'm imagining that they're created from the viewpoint of the 41st millennium, looking back at events in the 31st millennium, over 10,000 years. They are themselves a recreation of a historical past. And there are details on this map that are different than if the map were the Sol System in the 41st millennium. I imagine that the maps were either created with the intent to venerate the ancient past, or they've just been copied many, many times over the course of 10,000 years, and each copy has become more embellished with religious themes. There's also the fact that the concept behind the Horus Heresy is also based largely upon Milton's Paradise Lost, such that the powerful angelic primarchs are literally waging war in the heavens. In this case, they're waging war in the stars. It's kind of a perfect kind of image. And of course, Warhammer draws heavily upon classical influences, so the fact that our moons and planets are all named after Roman gods and Greek gods is very fitting in this setting. So let's look at the details of this map. Now, this is clearly the Sol System as it is in the 31st millennium as opposed to the 41st millennium, because there are actually a lot of changes. Man, when you get into the lore of each of these planets and each of these moons, oh my goodness, it's ridiculous. My first attempt was to incorporate all that, and this would be a much longer video if I did so, and much more rambly. So this is, in my knowledge, the first attempt to map the Sol System within the context of these games. The Sol or Terran system is our own solar system, and it's located in the Segmentum Solar. It's really named after our sun, which is probably also a metaphor for the Emperor's holy light, of course. And, it's the location of Holy Terra in the center of the Imperium Mam within the wider area of the galaxy. So we've all seen maps of our solar system that list the planets in the order from the sun. And this map follows that familiar format, but with some very noticeable Warhammer twists. The amount of lore and stories surrounding kind of this solar system is really quite incredible. So, you have basically these rings that, surround each of the planets, that basically traces their orbit around the sun. And the moons on each of the planet are really kind of arranged in these kind of geometric patterns. It's really almost an attempt to impose symmetry, which is a reminiscent of like Leonardo's of the Vitruvian Man. It's very similar to me. That's something that kind of drew my eye. Obviously, that's not the orbit of the actual moons, but it's kind of just this interesting geometric pattern that provides kind of order. Now, the sun almost has the impression of an armillary sphere, which is, so it has these kind of rotating rings around it. It's basically like a globe-like object that consists of a spherical framework of rings centered on the Earth and Sun, and each of these rings represents kind of the celestial longitude and latitude and other astronomically important features. So first up, the closest planet to the Sun, here's Mercury. And in the 31st millennium, I don't think any of these details changed. It's basically a mining world. And next we have this Venus, which is basically an industrial world. And beyond that, we encounter our first oddity with this little guy. I'm going to zoom in on some of this stuff. You can't quite read a lot of the detail, but you can certainly, know a little bit more about what I'm pointing to. This little black sphere here. This is designated as Artifact 9 Kappa Mu by the Adeptus Mechanicus. It's a mysterious relic of unknown origin that registers on the earliest stellar charts. It's a geodesic sphere of black metal, 30 kilometers in diameter, and it was marked by kind of passages and catacombs throughout. There's a lot more to this, but that's all we really need to know. It's this little strange object in our universe. Alright, after that you have Terra and Luna, the moon, the throne world of the Imperium. So here you have this kind of beautiful halo effect and this kind of star effect, very distinguished compared to many other planets in the solar system, as it should be. And now this type of effect really makes an impression, and it's generally only for cities like Rome that are given that type of distinction. So I'm going to pull up a comparative sample here. So this is the Peutinger map. And it's the only printed map in existence. It's very strange. It's about a foot tall, 23 feet long, and it has no pretense in trying to capture kind of geographic space or like a realistic depiction of geography. It's purely interested in the practicality of road and travel between cities. So I bring this up because this is Rome, and again it has kind of a halo effect around the city, and you've probably heard of the phrase all roads lead to Rome. So around the city are all these Roman roads that are kind of spiraling out like a spider's web, and so quite literally all roads probably did lead to Rome, and because they're operating within the same space with the same meaning and significance, this is a really perfect adaptation to the Sol map. Because basically Terra functions in the 41st and the 31st millennium the same way that Rome did to the ancient Romans. It is the center of the galaxy. So I think that's an appropriate feature and quite cool. Obviously, in this rendition, you have all these kind of orbital fortifications, as Terra is extremely heavily fortified, which is nice to see. And beyond that, you have Mars. Here. It's a forge world, obviously, and the homeworld of the Adeptus Mechanicus. And there's its little moon. And basically, the alliance between Mars and Terra is what allowed the Imperium to actually get any type of traction and move forward. But here is another oddity. Okay, this little sphere here. Okay, this is another artificial comet that orbits the solar system in a wide elliptical orbit every 1,000 years. It was seen in the heavens when the Emperor secured the unity of Terra, and a shrine was created on its surface to commemorate the Unification Wars. So that story is very reminiscent of many different comet spotting stories throughout history. Julius Caesar was famously declared to be a god by his heir when he saw a comet going through the sky. And obviously kind of Sigmar's twin-tailed comet is another kind of good example of that. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. Not your typical thing. So beyond that, we have this little planetoid up here. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. I guess it'd be like a Ceres. And Ceres is a dwarf planet. It's a real celestial body located in an asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Again, it has some use in the 40k lore and the 30k lore as well. And beyond that, we have Jupiter. And this is a kind of a forge world / mining world. It's the site of the ancient orbital Jovian shipyards. So kind of a huge industrial military complex in the solar system. Beyond that, you have Saturn. And kind of its moon, Enceladus. These are mostly occupied by the Inquisition. There's another moon reference here, this little piece. I can't quite make it out. I think it refers to Titan, which is the homeworld of the Grey Knights, obviously. And later on, the Adeptus Mechanicus would actually teleport a moon from Mars to Saturn during the Beast Arises narrative. But yeah, there's so much stuff going on, it's ridiculous. Then we go to Uranus. And Uranus was never had occupied. It does have plenty of orbiting colonies. And during the Dark Age of technology, humanity built a stable warp route known as the Elysian Gate, which is represented here by this little purple swirl. And then, kind of beyond that, you have Neptune with its moon Triton. And then we're into the Kuiper Belt. Now, the Kuiper Belt is, again, a real legit thing in our solar system. It's basically, a region of many comets and asteroids and other small bodies that are largely made of ice. So obviously, Warhammer understanding of the solar system predates Neil deGrasse Tyson's kind of efforts to unname Pluto as a planet. And so Pluto still plays a significant role here. It's still kind of a prominent feature on the map. And it too has a fixed warp gate, right, located right here. And so those are extremely important, portions of the galaxy, and obviously that's where kind of the Horus is going to kind of pour through. Now, interestingly, there are two other dwarf planets here, which is Make and Eris. Eris is named after the Greek goddess of strife and discord. Make, I don't really have a clue. As far as I can tell, these are both legit things. Make seems to be one of those temporary names that they sometimes give a place, and for whatever reason it's just kind of stuck. They were just both discovered in 2005, so these are brand new additions. If they designed this map before then, they wouldn't even, have been conceivable on there. So it's interesting to me. I really don't know what their plan is for those or why they decided to add them on. Why not, I guess? And Make seems like a very un-Warhammer name, unless it's like something to do with dwarves or something, or squats in 40K. Who knows? So surrounding the map are, various imperial symbols, angelic kind of figures. I'm going to zoom out here so you can get the whole scope. I'll go back into my little slideshow and pause it. Okay. Yeah, so around it you have a lot of different images of death, angelic figures, plenty of Gothic architecture, and you have this scroll that really kind of adorns the title. The color palette is fairly muted, but I like how the brightest areas really surround the sun, and then it tapers out across the system. It's not super obvious, but it's definitely kind of a feature. And as a complement to the aesthetic, you also have a lot of images of death on the left-hand side. These kind of like Reaper type of images, and these kind of, they're kind of angels, but they're also kind of malnourished, kind of grotesque versions and little skulls. This eye, I assume, is related to kind of Horus. And, on the other side, closer to Terra, you have more kind of angelical figures. And so I think that's, an obvious aesthetical choice to denote kind of the direction of the campaign, and who's the attacker and who's on the defense. Because Horus obviously begins his invasion in the outer regions and then moves inward. Alright, so let's go to the second map here. This one's much more high definition. I'm going to quickly go to slideshow. Oh, that's terrific. Alright. So there isn't a great sense of scale here, but the Imperial Palace is quite massive. The walls are said to be, measured in thousands of miles. So this is quite a significant chunk of real estate here. And I'll just put a kind of a pin in this that, so obviously the Imperial Palace is being besieged. And if you're not aware, the site of the Imperial Palace is in the middle of the Himalayan mountains. So it's really, north of India, kind of right along, that region. It's kind of crazy that they decided that would be the location for such a kind of a Eurocentric type of game that draws most of its inspiration from kind of European and Mediterranean history. I think it's a really cool kind of feature. So basically what you're seeing here is like the entire mountain ranges of the Himalayas. One of these is probably Everest, right? I don't know which one. And the map shows the location of the traitor forces surrounding the palace on all sides, and penning in kind of the loyal sources within the palace here. The colors are fairly similarly muted, but here you get kind of a dirty and stained red that represents kind of the traitors. And in contrast, you get these kind of golden glow around each of the main, buildings and main centers, and that really connects well with kind of like this beautiful kind of scroll work and gold work. There's no way in which you can really confuse the two here. There's a really good sense of order versus chaos. And down here's another armillary sphere, like the sun in the first one. And these are extremely common in Renaissance artwork. You see a lot of them. So it's kind of a nice touch. And honestly, this little hourglass with the skulls and the broken masonry, that's another really nice one as well. It really gives a sense of time and obviously impending doom. The term katabatic, which you see really everywhere. Right? You got katabatic slopes here, all around. I will zoom in a little bit here. All around the Imperial Palace. These are all katabatic plains. And it says raised by the order of the emperors Praetorian, something like that. So these are obviously decreed to be spaces to be raised for defensive purposes, much as like in the past you would clear, from your walls, make sure there's no trees right up to it so you can get a clear sense of sight, you know what the enemy's doing. I guess they just raised, thousands of square miles of buildings and, and such, just to make sure that they could visually see what was going on. So katabatic basically means, it's usually in the reference to like katabatic winds that are going downwards. And so, again, this is, I guess, emphasizing to some extent that the Imperial Palace is on very high elevation and everyone's trying to kind of move up these slopes towards it. So the walls and gates are all named, Europa, Adamant. They all go around. And, each of these gates is pretty important. And, I'm sure these are all linking to events described in the books. Now, obviously, this is a map that is about the Imperial Palace, but clearly the attack on the Helios Gate here is significant. Now, the Helios Gate is down here in the map. And this is basically a good example of an inset, the way I described it earlier in that historical map of the Argonautica. And, when you look at the attack here, there's a distinctive divide aesthetically between the traders on one side, again in red, and the loyalists, the defenders, in gold. Up and down this side, this little skull in the corner with like a little chaos, half submerged symbol. You have 3 lines of defense. This inner line is a line of trenches. You see these types of thing on like maps of World War I. And then you have, obviously, or kind of castle defenses. So again, it's kind of an abstraction from what might have been reality. They're looking back in time and not maybe not quite knowing what was going on or what it would have looked like. Or maybe it does. Maybe when you read the Horus Heresy books about this, that's exactly the way they describe it. I'll be interested to know. But you have very kind of classical medieval fortifications, and here you have attacking like little siege towers, right? Like conventional kind of wooden siege towers. Very interesting. Again, like it's this pullback to previous historical periods that I personally really enjoy. So I think both maps, also they really both give this appearance that they're on this aged parchment here. This is kind of stained. The other one had a lot of age spots in the corners. I often kind of get annoyed by that representation, like when someone has like an old treasure map and it's like this old brown thing. I think that's like we're hypersensitive to that because most modern books are cheap, mass-produced things that are made of wood pulp. They incorporate a lot of acid, and if you have like a cheap paperback novel, it just falls apart literally within a couple decades. The acid just kind of eats through the paper. A lot of the historical books and atlases I've worked with are just, sometimes they're 300, 400, 500 years old, and they're in absolute pristine condition. They look like they were just printed yesterday. Part of that's because they're super expensive and they've been taken care of, but also part of it's just the fact that, we didn't, the process by which we made these things is much more lengthy and time-consuming, and a lot more effort was put into kind of quality over quantity. They're made out of basically a textile material as opposed to wood pulp. They just tend to last long. Now, I'm not going to be too critical here because there's very few substances on Earth that would last 10,000 years, so this map would almost certainly have to be copied many, many times. So, I'll certainly give them a break on that account. So, all in all, like, both these maps are just kind of stunning works of art, in my opinion. I love these like little statues up here holding them up. Just little details all over the place. I think you could push the aesthetic maybe a little further in some areas. I would love to see kind of more Latin areas and things like that. But all in all, I'm really happy with these maps. And when I go back to kind of the principles that I discussed earlier, I think both maps do a great job in kind of imitating the themes. Let me bring both up here real quick. There we go. And, I think a lot of detail and care was clearly given to the design and aesthetic. And there's definitely a sense of grand scale and reverence for the topic from the perspective of whoever would have made these maps within the context of the games. Both maps are drawing upon historical themes and images, and that's something that I can certainly appreciate. So I'm really happy to see this type of aesthetic being applied to 40K. I would love to also see it being applied to Age of Sigmar. Maps about the Age of Myth, or who knows, right? You can really go back. I want to see a variety of maps, frankly. The bird's eye maps in Age of Sigmar are just gorgeous as well. But I also want to see maps that are less scientific and a little more artistic, that are kind of a good fit for the pseudo-myth and veneration that especially kind of these ancient topics really represent. Things like the Horus Heresy really work well. So in the past, Games Workshop has published kind of a variety of star maps that really portray our galaxy, and these do provide kind of a necessary utility. They provide a useful mental construct for the relative positions of planets like Fenris, Baal, Cadia, Terra, etc. And those maps have a place. But they're also just a little bit too sophisticated for the grim dark of the first millennium. I think they simply lack a lot of the traditional influences that, in my opinion, make Warhammer 40k truly amazing. So the maps we've examined really fill that niche beautifully. So I'm going to finish the video with a quick shout out to the artist responsible for the maps. This is an artist by the name of Francesca. I'm going to put her Twitter tag down below. She's a freelance artist and a cartographer based in Italy who's worked on projects throughout the game and publishing industry. She really kind of works on wide spectrum of different mediums. The aesthetic seems to be fairly consistent. It's the same type of color palette in a lot of her works from what I can see, but obviously the topic is different, and she's done work for like Game of Thrones and all sorts of things. So I really hope Games Workshop continues to commission her talent for their games. I'm placing, as I said, some of her notes down in the notes for this video, and you can find a lot of other cool examples of artwork on her account, so check that out. Hopefully you like this video, and I'll see you in the future. Have a good one. Bye.